Hello everybody, for those of you who don't know me, my name is André Sören. I've been an Ableton product specialist for a number of years, as well as teaching across a number of different schools. Teaching Ableton Live, of course, but also Push and how you can get the most out of both of them, both in performance contexts, in production contexts, and, well, a whole bunch of different scenarios. This tutorial, or I think it's a little bit more of a tip or a series of tips, follows on from my last video, which covered how you can create a sort of super instrument rack. And by that, I mean a bunch of instruments, a bunch of Ableton native or VST instruments brought together in one instrument rack and set up in such a way that you can use a chain selector like I have here to move between the different sounds and then have for each of those always the same controls. So for example, the filter, the drive, here I've got an LFO, my attack and release controls, and the volume. I showed you how to make this really, really quickly with a bunch of shortcuts which are not so well known. And the point of today's tip is to really show you how important it starts to be when you apply it to either using Push or in a live set or anything else where you need to move quickly and just not lose time clicking with your mouse and your keyboard. And the reason this is important is because so often when you're making electronic music in particular, you find yourself switching contexts, switching between synthesizers, switching between screens, switching between software, switching between plugin windows. And I am of the total and dedicated belief that this kills your flow, that this can very often be a big problem in just moving forward. And particularly when you might not have the time to master all of those things separately. And that's very often the case for people who are, for example, making music now and then. But enough philosophy, let me get into what I'm talking about today. What I'm talking about today, I think the best way I could describe it is having a modular approach to making racks. And when I talk about racks, I mean instrument racks and I mean effect racks. So instrument racks, as you saw in the other video, which I will link below, that's a way of bringing lots of sounds into one device. And that's something that I will show on my screen later on. And effect racks can be audio racks, i.e. all of the racks which come after the instrument rack and of course can affect the sound. And the MIDI effect racks are the ones that come before it. This will be familiar to many of you, but of course not to everybody. So if we move over to Ableton Live for just a moment, here you can see the setup. It's very simple. I've got three racks here. Three tracks rather, an instrument rack, a bass track and a lead track. And if I open up the bottom here, you can see that each one is populated with a number of different racks. And there's something that you'll notice is that they are very similar from track to track, and I'll explain why that's very important in a moment. So here you can see an instrument rack, just as I created in the other tutorial. Before it you can see two other racks which are all controlling how the MIDI notes or MIDI effects are affected before they arrive in the instrument. And after that, of course, you only have audio coming out. So then you have some other racks which are all to do with dealing with the audio in different ways. If I come back to Push, what's so great about this is that if I, for example, go from my bass track where I have some bass sounds and I move over to my lead track, you'll see that I have exactly the same controls from one to the other. So the chain selectors and the filters and so on and so forth. In retrospect, it's an obvious thing for me, but it took me a while to get to this point because what I used to do is I would say, well, I really want to have different aspects of sounds, different kinds of things controlled on each different track because they're all quite different, right? And that's not something which is an incorrect assumption. But the problem with this is that as you move between them, you're constantly saying, okay, I want the filter. No, the filter is here on this track or there or wherever. And this is a killer. Certainly is for me. Perhaps it's just my limited brain CPU. But the more that I've set up my racks so that they are the same across all channels where possible, the more I have just flown. And as some of you might have seen from some of my performance videos on YouTube, I can move quite quickly between different sounds and I can go and look for new ones if I need to. And this is basically, from my point of view, the secret behind that. Now, what some of the eagle-eyed amongst you will have spotted is that I actually have two chain selectors. And that's because I have one chain here moving between different kinds of instruments, and I have another chain here moving between different varieties of that same instrument. So that's kind of like a super duper instrument rack. And I will show you how to make that sometimes. I'm sure I'm going to get that question in the comments. And that will most likely be part of the big online course that I'm going to be setting up for Ableton Push and Ableton Live respectively, where I'm going to be able to go into these things in more detail, because unfortunately, with the time I've got available, I can only dive in so far making content on YouTube. Moving on, I'm not going to go into each rack in detail, because that is again something I will do in future sessions and in the online courses. But I will give you a quick overview. And what I have here are over on the left, I've got the arpeggiators and anything allowing me to rhythmically influence the notes. So here I can have the arpeggiator off or on. Very simple. And after that I have what I call the expression rack, where I've set the velocity sensitivity options so that when I'm playing live, I don't risk too much from playing a very hard, very loud note, which is both bad for people in the audience and also for the musicality of the thing. So I reduce essentially the amount of expression that I have per instrument, which musically you could say is a sad thing, but when you're moving so quickly with different instruments, it helps a lot. Then I have the instrument rack. And I should have just go back here and show that there's also pitch control, which is very useful for basically shifting this range from up and down basically, so that I don't need to spend any time moving octave up and down. Here I will already have my pitch in the right place. So in this case I'd have my bass probably an octave down at least, and I can keep this same range. This again stops me from moving my hands to different places, and it's just yet another way of not blocking myself by changing context and by having to add more things to think about and to press. And this is the key. I'm just looking for ways to reduce and throw things out so that I have to make fewer decisions, fewer movements, fewer clicks, and it's worked really well for me. If I move along, you'll see I have the instrument rack. I always put this in the third position because I only really need two for MIDI, and there's usually a lot of audio things need to go on after the signal comes out of the instrument. And with a drum kit, you'll see that actually it's the pad which lands here in the third one. So if I move, for example, to these different pads, you'll see them lighting up here. And I've also done that because this is essentially what allows me to create a rhythm, whereas that's done over here with the ARP. But I think I'm going into a bit too much detail here. What I will say about this, and you'll see this called the rhythm rack, the rhythm, which is totally and completely inspired by the analog rhythm from Electron, because I think it is amazing and I wanted to do some similar things with my drum rack. So I've made the most powerful drum rack I've ever seen. I've watched a lot of tutorials, I've watched a lot of content, and I don't think I've ever seen one quite as ludicrous as this. And it's not to brag, it's just to say I put a lot of thought and work into this, and that is also something I'm going to be covering in the online course, because it's a huge topic and it's been amazing for me. I mean, I'll give you a quick example in that I can move between all my snares. I have individual effect control for each ones. So I can put, I need to choose it first, of course. I can put reverb on the clap or on the snare, but not at the same time. This is a big deal. So if you're interested to hear about that, please leave a comment below. I will come back to it, but it's going to be part of the online course. So just going to be upfront about that. That's a really good one, though. I think it's really one of the things I love the most that I created the last few years. Moving back to where we were. So there's the instrument rack with all of the things I pointed out before. And if you've missed any of those, check the video link below. Here I've got a 5-band EQ, essentially, just letting me just kind of sculpt the sound after it's come out of the bass rack. Very important, obviously, to drop some stuff out of the mix and bring some things up. You need to make space for the other instruments, of course. You'll see very different things going on over here. So for example, on the lead section, LD, I'm bringing up the highs and pushing down the lows. And here on the bass track, I'm attenuating the lows a little bit and bringing up one section, kind of mids, I guess you could say, while dropping the highs, just to make space for each other. And this is a little bit, I think, as with many mixing decisions, kind of a mix of good practice and trial and error. And this setup has worked pretty well for me. If I move along to the next one, I have basically one last section of EQ and compression. Then I have my favorite effects to really tear up the sound. And wait, that's not going to sound so good with this filter all the way down. So let's come back here. Can add a lot of dirt and angry noise to those sounds, as you will often hear in my music, especially of late. I have one last EQ 3, which is just giving me some basic controls to just grab hold of it if need be. And in the past, I've used secondary controllers to just quickly have those to hand, just like you would on a DJ mixer, basically. And then finally, there's a limiter at the end, which I know some of you might not like to see because, yeah, obviously it's going to be sort of ducking and compressing the sound that little bit more now and then, but it's really, again, to protect this situation where I'm playing live and somehow accidentally I send something super duper loud through the chain. This is just that kind of last defense against anything going wrong. So I think that's a pretty good overview of those basic devices, those racks. And the point of this is, as I can only repeat so many times, and I know you need to do this sometimes to have ideas land, is that these are always the same. You'll see across both racks that here's my EQ5, there's the glue compressor, here's the compressor there, here's the multi-effects, which is the same kind of effects for both. You'll see them, they're both just the same, except colored differently. And this is something which I find very, very useful. And what I actually really love, and you will have heard this kind of thing before, is this reduction of choice, and that often just having these 8 knobs, just having 8 tracks, for example, which is another thing I work with, and just having 8 racks basically is a great constraint for just making you squeeze more out of them. And the analogy I often like to make is that when, for example, you're playing a traditional classical instrument, you might have a piano, and there you have a certain number of parameters you can change. And they're actually quite limited if you think about it. Of course, you can play different notes, different pitches, let's say. You can play them for different lengths of time. You can play them harder or softer. You have 2 or 3 pedals where you can extend or adjust the sound. So we're talking 5, 6, 7 parameters perhaps, and you can make the most amazing music with a piano. So my theory has been over the years that I need to, where I can, reduce myself to 8 things. So 8 parameters, 8 devices, 8 tracks. So you would think that 8 is my favorite number, but I actually have a different favorite number, but that's gonna be, I tell you, if I get to 10,000 subscribers, then I will do a favorite number reveal. Okay, I don't think you'll care about that. Right. Everybody, thank you for watching. This has been a video all about why it makes sense to build racks for instruments and effects that are the same across all of your channels. Now, I don't know whether this will be coming through in the video, but some of you with eagle ears, if that's even a phrase, might be able to hear the music coming through from my upstairs neighbours who may or may not be somewhat inebriated, but hey, it's the lockdown and anything goes these days. I hope it's been useful. I hope that this concept of bringing things together in few racks with a few controls helps you build up some muscle memory like it has done for me. Do please let me know in the comments if you think this is something that has been useful. If you have any questions, drop them there as well. I'll do my best to answer them as much as I can. And do sign up in the link below if you'd like to hear about the other content I'll be dropping on YouTube without fail, and also the online school that I'm setting up because I'll be covering this stuff in way more detail there. Some of you have already been asking me, when's it all coming? I'm working on it as we speak, and I'm making these YouTube tutorials in the meantime to keep dropping some hopefully useful tips here and there. I hope you're all safe out there. I hope you've got Ableton with you under the covers every night, so to speak. And thank you for watching.